Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first CADTH Lecture of 2024 and Happy New Year. We're just watching the numbers of participants enter into the system, so just give us a moment to get started. I might do a quick introduction for myself. I'm Nicole Mittman. I'm the Chief Scientist and Vice President of Scientific Evidence, Methodologies, and Resources at CADTH, and I'll be moderating today's talk. I may start with the following. You may have seen an announcement that CADTH will become the Canadian Drug Agency. I want to let you know that we are still CADTH, and this is still the CADTH Lecture Series. We will expand our expertise in the drug sector to build the Canadian Drug Agency while upholding the core principles that guide us and the organization. We are moving forward to bringing the Canadian Drug Agency into life in partnership with the provinces and the territories, and informed by the work of the Canadian Drug Agency Transition Office as well. There are many details still to be ironed out. And so before we take on our new role, I look forward to updating you when we are farther along in the process. So why don't we start with our territorial acknowledgement? Really, I wanted to acknowledge that I am a settler born outside of Canada, but with family roots far away from here as well. And I'm speaking to you from Toronto, which is on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. CADTH recognizes the inherent and treaty rights of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples across this land. We are committed to moving forward in a partnership with Indigenous communities in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. I'd like to encourage you to think about where you live, work, play, and acknowledge the people who lived here before you, cared for, and sustained the land you call home. So let's talk about the CADTH Lecture Series. We launched this CADTH Lecture Series in 2014, so people from across Canada and beyond could hear directly from prominent scholars and opinion leaders about pressing issues facing health technology assessment and healthcare today. Today's lecture in particularly is about cancer care, and in particular, a new global initiative that focuses on recalibrating oncology to deliver more patient-centered and equitable care that will measurably improve the lives of cancer patients. Launched as a grassroots organization or a movement in 2023, the Common Sense Oncology initiative is tackling challenges related to evidence generation, evidence interpretation, and evidence communication. The goal is to facilitate a future in which patients, regardless of where they live, have access to the cancer treatments that make them meaningful differences in their lives. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Our speaker today is one of the founding leaders of the Common Sense Initiative. Dr. Christopher Booth is a medical oncologist and health services researcher at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. He holds a Canada Research Chair in Population Cancer Care and is also a member of the World Health Organization's Essential Medicines List Cancer Working Group. A bit of a mouthful for you, apologies. In 2022, Dr. Booth received the Exceptional Healer Award at Kingston Health Sciences Centre for embodying compassion, respect, and clinical excellence. Christopher, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Mittman, for that kind introduction and the opportunity to speak here today. I'm just going to load my slides. Can you see those, Nicole?
I can see them.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks. So yeah, thanks everyone. As Dr. Mittman said, I'm a medical oncologist here in Kingston, and so I split my time between the Cancer Center, where I look after patients with GI cancers, and the other half of my time I run a health services research unit where we're interested in exploring the really big picture issues of cancer care, about access to care, equity in care, quality of care, and outcomes. By way of disclosures, I have no relationships with the pharmaceutical industry, but the disclosures that I do want to make relate to the content we're going to discuss, and putting that in context with what is really the greatest privilege of my career, which is looking after patients who have cancer. And so I'm going to be somewhat critical of our field over the next 30 minutes or so, But I just want to start by acknowledging that this work and the Common Sense Oncology Initiative comes from a place of very authentic and deep caring for the patients and the families that we have the privilege of looking after. And it's the idea that while we do many things well, we can probably do better in some regards. And so this movement in the lecture today will focus on some of those areas. And the essence of oncology, or the art of medicine, as I imagine it in cancer care, is that it's really centered around the delivery of compassionate care. And that might involve treatments, but if it involves treatments, it should be treatments that actually really help patients. And so I think one of the themes that we'll hear about today is that while there certainly are many cancer treatments that provide very large benefits for patients, what is not often talked about is the fact that a lot of the new treatments offer very small and sometimes perhaps no real benefit. And I think that we can do better as a field, and this is part of the conversation to see how we can become solution focused. The talk today is going to be arranged in 3 sections. I'm going to open with 3 paradoxes of cancer care to set the stage about some of the challenges in our field. I'm then going to talk about what I conceptualize as the value crisis in cancer care. And then the third part of the discussion will be focused around the new initiative that we launched just this past year called Common Sense Oncology, which is a broad-based, inclusive grassroots movement for all people in the cancer system who care about how we can do better for our patients. So I'm just going to start with this slide, which is really, I think, the domains and the really big picture issues that draw all of us into the work that we do in cancer care delivery and research, whether we're clinicians or policymakers, patient advocates, academics or researchers. I think at the end of the day, we care about the following things, which is access to care, equity, health justice, affordability, quality of care, outcomes, and patient-centeredness. And I think in some elements, when the cancer system has perhaps started to go off the rails, it might be because we've lost sight of these core domains. And so I like to start with these just to keep us grounded. So moving on to the paradoxes, I call this the cancer medicine paradox. And so on the one hand, I think it's increasingly recognized that there's a fair amount of overutilization of marginal, toxic, and expensive medicines, especially near the end of life. But at the same time, due to problems with access and affordability, most patients in the world do not get those cancer treatments which do make a big difference in their lives. The next paragraph I call the last 6 months of life paradox, and I think this will be familiar to any of the clinicians participating today, but also patients and families who have the lived experience of looking after a loved one or walking the cancer journey, especially in the last year of life. And this is a scenario that's quite common in cancer centers across Canada and the US and many other countries, which is that an oncologist will see a patient with an advanced incurable solid cancer where the cancer is growing despite first-line, second-line therapy. And there's a third-line cancer drug, which is actually funded by the public system. It's available, it's on guidelines. It'll cost the system about $200,000. It will have side effects for the patient. It will also make them come to the chemotherapy unit maybe 1 day a week or 1 day every couple of weeks. And the unfortunate reality is that for most of these treatments in this setting, there's no proven evidence that this treatment will help someone live longer. What it likely does is delays growth on a CAT scan of the tumor by a couple months. And so this is a scenario that plays out probably every day in most cancer centers around the country. The paradox is that for that very same patient who might live at home by themselves and be sick or vulnerable, lonely, and not feeling well, as many of us on the call today will recognize, it's almost impossible to mobilize the resources and the supports to allow that person to stay in their own home with enough nursing care, compassion, food, and palliative care. And so I think this is a great paradox for us to collectively address in a system that on the one hand can provide one thing very easily, yet fails to provide this other element, which is so important for all of us in the last year of life. And the last paradox to discuss today, just as opening comments for this lecture, I call the 3 buckets paradox. And this is something what we'll touch on later, which is that there's been, to some extent, a communication failure in cancer care and oncology, whereby we as oncologists have not done a very good job articulating to patients, the public, policymakers, and other stakeholders that the reality is there's probably three buckets of cancer treatments. And the first bucket are those treatments which are truly transformative and cure patients or add many, many months or many, many years of life. And so transformative in the lives of those individuals. The second bucket is treatments which are very good. They're very useful. They might not be as transformative as bucket number one, but they certainly really help people. And probably most of us would very eagerly want to have these if we were a patient in that circumstance. The problem is, increasingly in the modern era, a lot of our new treatments fall into the third bucket. And this is a bucket of treatments which have very, very small benefits. Most of them have no evidence they help people live longer or improve quality of life. And they have important side effects that our patients need to live through. And I think it's important for us to recognize there's at least these three buckets of cancer treatments, and so that we can more clearly talk about this so that patients and decision makers and families can make more informed choices about where they want to go with their own treatment decisions. So we're going to move now into the cancer value crisis. And so this is something I've thought about very deeply. I've had the privilege of looking after cancer patients for now 20 years and running my own academic research program for the last 15 years as a faculty member. And the cancer value crisis is a convergence of at least 5 factors. The first is that we've had problems with the way that we design and interpret clinical trials. And I do want to say at the outset that I remain a firm believer that the randomized controlled trial remains the gold standard to identify new therapies that really help patients in our field. So any criticisms of clinical trials are not meant to be seen as criticisms of the RCT in itself, but its design decision, or these problems have been self-inflicted by us as the investigators and the people who are leading the trials. So we've had some problems with clinical trials. We have an epidemic of dubious primary endpoints, and we'll spend some time discussing that. We have treatments that in many cases have very small effect sizes or small benefits. We have a context in which there's a staggering price of new cancer therapies. And fundamentally, I think there's been a communication breakdown, both within oncology, how we talk to each other as clinicians and practitioners, but also with our external partners, the public, patients, policymakers, and other stakeholders in the cancer system. And we're going to unpack each of these over the next 20 or 30 minutes. I'm not a health economist by any means. I'm a chemotherapy doctor. So the way I conceptualize value is very simple. It's the interface between the numerator, which is the magnitude of benefit, how much does the treatment help patients, and the cost, which is the lived experience, the side effects, clinical toxicity, but also the financial cost, which in many cases is borne by either the patient, the family, or of course the health system. And while in my field over the last decade, there's been a lot of discussion about the cost and the rising prices of cancer medicines, that's in the denominator. And I think we need to continue to speak out about that and advocate against those prices, which I believe in many cases are vastly unjustified. I think we also need to pay attention to the numerator, and especially as individual oncologists or clinicians or people who write clinical trials, we have as individuals very little control over the denominator, but in fact, we actually own the numerator. We are the people who design clinical trials. We are the experts that write guidelines. At the end of the day, we are the physicians and clinicians that make treatment recommendations to allow patients to make informed decisions about what they want to do. So a lot of the discussion today will focus on the numerator in the value context, and this largely relates to endpoints and effect size. So I just have 3 slides about the denominator, the economics. So this data is not yet published, it's under review, and this has been a collaboration between our group here at Queen's Cancer Research Institute and very close colleagues at Cancer Care Ontario. This curve shows the annual spending by the public health system in Ontario of cancer medicines over the last decade. And you can see that over the last decade, we've gone from spending about $500 million to $1.7 billion. The rate of growth of this curve is staggering. And so our system, the spending increase on an annual basis for cancer medicines is now 15% annual increase. And so we need to put this in context and recognize that the rest of the healthcare budget and spending is increasing closer to 5%. And in fact, when you look at the rising costs of medicines outside oncology, we're doubling that rate. And so you don't need to look too far forward in the future until you can imagine a scenario where potentially the entire medicine budget for our health system could be consumed by oncology drugs. And so this is something we'll come back to because we need to talk about this and think about very carefully where we can put the most resources to help the most patients. The second challenge with the economics of cancer medicines was addressed by this paper we published now about 5 or 6 years ago in Lancet Oncology, where we asked a very practical question that all of us ask ourselves and see and practice every day in our life. If we have a growing family and we need a larger apartment or a bigger house, we spend more money, we get a larger house. If we want to keep up with our kids on their skateboards and we need a new fancy skateboard as a middle-aged dad, we spend more money and get a skateboard that's a little bit faster and a little bit better. And we asked, does that relationship apply to cancer medicines? And we found that not only is there no association between the magnitude of benefit and drug price, we found that if anything, there's an inverse relationship whereby the drugs with the smallest benefits have the largest price. And I don't think you need a PhD in economics to recognize that's a very broken system. And the final piece of work from our group I want to comment on related to the economics of cancer medicine was this paper published 2 years ago in the journal Cancer. And this was led by a team of medical students. And we had a very simple question. I was curious to know, when you look at the global pharmaceutical sector, what are they doing when it comes to oncology? And so we had this team of medical students and residents review the financial reporting documents for the 10 largest pharma companies in the world for each of 10 years. So if you can imagine, it was a huge amount of paper to go through reviewing these very, very thick documents. But we had a very simple question and one piece of data we really wanted from each document, which was, if you look at the overall sales revenue for these pharma companies in any given year, what proportion of the sales revenue is from cancer medicines compared to non-cancer medicines? And you can see from the orange curve that really the entire pharma sector has pivoted into oncology. So over the last decade, there was a 70% increase in revenues from cancer medicines, while there was an 18% decrease in sales revenue from other medicines. And so on the surface, this might appear like a good news story for oncology and patients with cancer in our field. And certainly it's exciting to see lots of innovation and resources, but I do believe that there's alarm bells flashing for at least 2 reasons. First of all, I think all of us will agree that there's many other diseases and public health problems that require innovation, investment, and new treatments. And so we need to be mindful of that. But the other issue is that there's very few, if any, circumstances in life where more and more and more money causes good things and not necessarily big problems. And I think the huge financial pressures that now shape cancer care and cancer research are at least one of the factors that have gotten us into some of the trouble that we're going to talk about today. So leaving cost in the denominator of the value construct and moving now to the numerator, endpoints and effect size. This is a slide from a luminary Canadian oncologist, Professor Ian Tannick from Princess Margaret Hospital, who is one of my teachers and has been a very close friend, mentor, and colleague now for many years. And when we were training, Dr. Tannick would drill into our heads that when it came to treatment of any disease, patients, and in fact, all of us as current or future patients, are probably interested really in 2 things. We would want new treatments that help us live longer and help us live better lives. And so fundamentally, this means that really the cornerstone endpoints of phase 3 randomized controlled trials are overall survival and quality of life. And as we'll see, in many circumstances, that is not being done now in our field. This is a study we published 2 years ago in JAMA Oncology. We've been doing this work actually since I was a resident many years ago at Princess Margaret Hospital. We've been tracking randomized controlled trials in medical oncology of drug therapies, and we've been looking to see how they've changed over time. And you can see back in the 1970s and 80s, the primary endpoint was overall survival. So most clinical trials were being designed and conducted to see if the new treatment would help people live longer lives. But you can see over time, overall survival has decreased. And now in the modern era, only about 30% of clinical trials are testing treatments to see if they can help people live longer. Instead, there's a new endpoint, or the new kid on the block, or what I call the king of oncology, which is now something called progression-free survival, which is a composite endpoint which includes survival, but is largely driven by increasing size of tumors on a CAT scan. And so you can see here, we live in an era now where almost half of clinical trials are being designed to see if they can delay the amount of growth of a tumor on a CAT scan. The other very important figure on this slide is, of course, we live in an era where now 90% of randomized trials of cancer medicines are funded by the pharmaceutical sector. I'm just going to comment briefly about what progression-free survival means and where it came from, because it's a really important part of the story. Progression-free survival was an endpoint that was designed to guide early phase clinical trials, phase 1 or phase 2 trials, when they were using new compounds and they wanted to get an idea, is there any signal of activity? Do the tumors shrink or do they grow? And if they shrink, is it worth taking them to phase 3 testing to see if they can help people live longer and better lives? And so this was really invented in the 1990s to guide phase 1 and 2 trials. And one of the people who invented it was one of my teachers, colleagues, and mentors, Dr. Elizabeth Eisenhower, here at Queen's and of the Canadian Cancer Trials Group. And so Elizabeth and many of us became quite concerned about 10 years ago when we saw this endpoint that was invented to guide phase 1 trials begin to move into phase 3 testing. And the definition of progression-free survival can be triggered by if a patient dies, but it's largely triggered by arbitrary amounts of growth on a tumor. It was an arbitrary decision that a 20% increase in a tumor would be considered progression, and that would count as an event. But you can imagine a tumor that might be, 2 centimeters in a lung. If it grows to 2.5 centimeters, it's probably not going to make the patient feel any different. The question was, does it predict how long they live? And in the early years, it was hoped it would get answers sooner and would allow us to get an idea about which drugs help patients live longer and better lives. So let's go through that. Progression-free survival might be useful if it is a surrogate or it predicts for what really matters to patients, which is overall survival and quality of life. And we've learned now over the last decade through careful statistical analysis that in some circumstances, it makes a lot of sense to use progression-free survival when it is a valid surrogate for overall survival. However, in the vast majority of circumstances, it has failed to be proven that PFS predicts how long someone lives. It's also not the case that it predicts quality of life. So progression-free survival, however, might also be useful if in itself it has intrinsic meaning to patients about knowing about growth of tumors on a CAT scan. This is something that's often talked about, but I think we have to take a step back and recognize this itself is far from certain, especially given the trade-offs that patients have to live through with the side effects, the cost of their time, which is traded off from spending time with their family, and the financial costs of therapy. And in fact, our group did a major study on this last year and published it where we actually asked patients with incurable cancer who were on active treatment, so they knew what life was like on treatment, and we wanted to get a sense from them if a new treatment with side effects would not help them live any longer, how interested in the treatment would they be if it delayed tumor growth on a CAT scan? And it was very clear that the majority of patients were not interested in this. They expected treatments to help them live longer and better lives. And finally, even if point number 1 or 2 is true, what we've learned over the last couple of years is that at least some proportion of what looks like an improvement in progression-free survival in a clinical trial is probably a statistical artifact due to something called informative censoring, which I'm not going to get into today, but suffice it to say that there's many clinical trials where there might be an improvement in progression-free survival of a couple months, but when you adjust for this informative censoring, it completely disappears. So progression-free survival, this is an essay that Dr. Eisenhower and I wrote now a decade ago when it started to move into our field in a major way. And we asked the question 10 years ago, is this something that's meaningful or is it just something that's easy to measure? And fast forward 10 years, and we just published kind of the updated analysis of this in Journal of Clinical Oncology, and we've learned increasingly that it might not be meaningful or measurable. And I should mention that, the title for the second paper is probably a little bit strong. We're trying to be provocative, and there are circumstances where it makes a lot of sense to use surrogate endpoints, but I think those are the exception and not the rule, and our field has now completely moved to an era of surrogate endpoints. This is an important paper that came from our colleagues at the FDA in the US, and I show this because there's circumstances, and they wrote about this, where a drug which delays tumors on a CAT scan is approved and recommended in guidelines based on evidence of improved progression-free survival. When they follow these drugs forward in time, in fact, overall survival was less. So people were living less long because of the new therapy. So we really need to remember that these drugs can actually have significant harms. So we need to make sure we get this right. So the reality is, as I showed in that slide earlier, this is data from the US FDA. If you look over the last 20 years, about 400 new cancer drugs approved. 30% are approved because they have benefits with overall survival. Half of them are approved because of improvements in progression-free survival. And so what I've tried to make the case here, recognizing there are circumstances, and I'll acknowledge where it makes sense to use progression-free survival, but we now have an entire cancer research and cancer care system that is built on progression-free survival. And I do think we're on shaky ground. And we need at least to take a step back and recognize, what if we're wrong? Because these treatments have really, really significant side effects. And we need to think, should we go back to the drawing board when it comes to this endpoint? I'm now going to shift to the idea of effect size, or kind of magnitude of benefit. And so we've talked about the fact that unfortunately, most new cancer medicines do not have improvements in how long people live, but some of them do. And so this is the number that comes up over and over again, and work from our group as well as other groups around the world. In aggregate, for those minority of trials that show that the drugs help patients live longer, this is the median improvement in survival. So on average, we're looking at gains of about 2 or 3 months. Now, there's been clearly major transformative advances in our field in the last 10 or 20 years. And so this is an aggregate. And so what it tells you, though, is those transformative advances are really, probably exceptions floating in a sea of some pretty mediocre cancer drugs. And as someone who has spent 20 years looking after patients with advanced cancer, I certainly don't want to come across as uncaring or belittling the meaning of an extra 2 or 3 months of life. But this comes with important caveats that we really need to consider. There's the clinical toxicity and the lived experience of our patients who have to bear the side effect burden of these therapies. There's the financial toxicity that in many parts of the world is largely borne by the patient and family, and in our system is also borne by the healthcare system. And there are emerging concepts of time toxicity, as well as the gap between efficacy and effectiveness. I just want to unpack those a little bit. Time toxicity is something we started writing about a couple of years ago, and this is the concept of time in this circumstance relates to the time that we seek seeking healthcare. And of course, if we're seeking healthcare for a transformative benefit, or if we have many, many years of life to live, the amount of time we spend seeking healthcare is probably a very reasonable trade-off. But when we only have 6 or 12 months left to live, and every day becomes very precious and time is short, that's also the circumstance where our treatments have the smallest benefit. And so this is where we think we need to start talking about time toxicity. I'll just paraphrase here from our essay a couple of years ago. Time spent pursuing cancer treatment in waiting rooms, emergency rooms, and the chemotherapy unit is time that cannot be spent fishing, traveling, or visiting with loved ones. This trade-off becomes most pressing near the end of life, when time is short and many treatments offer small benefits. And so we've built on this concept, and we've argued that we need to do a better job as oncologists talking about this with our patients. It's certainly not up to me to decide how a patient should or should not spend their time. But I think we failed as oncologists and as clinical trialists by not generating the data and then having these meaningful discussions with our patients so they can make truly informed decisions about how and where they want to spend time, especially near the end of life. I think it's important for patients to know that there's been some advances in clinical trials where when you look at the trade-off, every extra day of life is offset by an extra day spent in hospital or the chemotherapy unit. And that's going to have different meaning for different patients. Again, recognizing everyone's different, but I think what we need to do better as a community is talk about this so patients have a better understanding of what they're signing up for. And then just the last concept related to this is what we call the gap between efficacy and effectiveness. And because patients that go on clinical trials generally are very different from patients in routine practice, the patients in trials tend to be younger, with less comorbidity, with better life expectancy, with better tumor characteristics. And so it's been shown over and over again that the benefits and the outcomes seen in clinical trials are always attenuated in routine clinical practice. So if we have a new drug that helps people live on average in a clinical trial of 2 months or 3 months, we know in the real world it's less. So is it 4 weeks? Is it 5 weeks? Is it 3 weeks? So this all needs to be balanced, of course, against all the things that we talked about when it comes to the patient's lived experience, but also the health system, recognizing that the average cost of many of these new cancer medicines is in the range of $200,000, $300,000 per year. So I was asked a few months ago by a journalist in the US who had not heard this story, they were a bit flabbergasted. They said, well, how did we get in this situation? So I've thought about this deeply for quite a while. And I think it's a convergence of two very powerful factors. And I think it's hope and money. And I think the hope comes from the place that this is obviously a very, very difficult circumstance, and these are difficult conversations to have. And all of us in the field, and especially the patients and their families, have hope that the treatment will help them and have hope that they will exceed expectations. And all of us hope that this new treatment, the trial, will work for our patient and will improve their outcomes. And so this obviously comes from a good place, and everyone in the system is trying their best to help patients. I think sometimes that can maybe impair decision making, and also it leads us and makes us vulnerable to hype. And where that comes, I think, is the money in the system. And there is huge financial pressures at every level of the system, from hospitals, from research institutions, from clinicians, from investigators, where there's so much money in the system that it clearly has an influence, whether we can see it or not, on how we deliver and research cancer care. Just going to touch briefly on a global piece of work just to kind of highlight the global relevance of this, and then we're going to shift into the discussion about Common Sense Oncology. I've had the privilege of the last 7 or 8 years of serving as a health policy advisor for the World Health Organization, where we make recommendations about the essential medicine list, which is really the core medicines that every public health system should aspire to deliver free of cost to patients in hospitals in those countries. And so we collectively with colleagues from around the world, we decided to move away from these boardrooms in Geneva and go to the front lines of clinical care and ask oncologists around the world which cancer medicines do they consider to be the most important. And we called this the Desert Island Project because it was a survey which was essentially built around the dinner party experiment we've all played before. Imagine you were moving to a desert island and you could only bring 3 books. What would those books be? Imagine you're going to a desert island and you could have dinner with any famous pharmacoeconomics professor except for Dr. McMittman. Who would it be? And so the thought experiment here was, imagine you're moving to a desert island with all the people in your country and you're in charge of cancer care. And the government puts you in charge of choosing cancer medicines which will be available for all patients free of charge, but you can only choose 10 medicines. Which medicines would you take to that desert island to provide the greatest benefit for the most patients? And the second part of the thought experiment was, okay, now that you've told us which medicines you want on the desert island, to what extent are these available in routine care for your patients right now? So we had responses from about 1,000 oncologists over 80 countries, and what we saw was that these oncologists are pretty pragmatic. The drugs that they put in their suitcase to take to the desert island were largely older drugs that have very, very large benefits. They're mostly old-fashioned chemotherapy and hormone drugs that we've had for 20 or 30 years. We know they have very large benefits. They also happen to be very inexpensive. If you look at the list, there are some of the newer drugs, and some of these new drugs are very expensive, but the drugs that made the list that are new and expensive are those drugs that really do have large benefits. And so we found that the oncologists are pretty pragmatic about which drugs they think offer the greatest benefits for their patients. But here's where things fall apart. When we said, to what extent are these actually available now in your real practice? Good old-fashioned doxorubicin has been around for decades. It's the cornerstone of many treatments, including breast cancer and lymphoma. We found that only 1/3 of doctors could provide it free of charge to all patients. About 1/3 could give it with significant cost to the patient and family, and 1/4 could give it, but it would cause catastrophic financial ruin for that patient and family. Likewise for trastuzumab, a really important drug in breast cancer, now available as a biosimilar, but we saw that only 15% of oncologists worldwide can provide to all women in their practice with breast cancer, and 2/3 of oncologists said, I can deliver it, but I will catastrophically ruin that patient's family for generations. So there's some big problems here between the drugs with large benefits and how we deliver them in routine practice. And so this is these are some essays we've published the last couple of years in Nature and Lancet Oncology, and it gets to the idea that we need to better recalibrate moonshot aspirational science, which is big tech science looking for the next great cancer treatment that will impact care in 5, 10, or 20 years. We need to keep doing that to inform care of tomorrow, but we can't forget about the patients today, and we need to ensure that we deliver the care optimally, that we really know help people, and that people get this care now without excessive barriers. So it was this constellation of observations and realities that led to the founding of the Common Sense Oncology Initiative. And so the story dates, I mean, this goes back many years for many of us who have been involved in this field now. But the paper kind of started last year when my good friend and colleague, Dr. Bishal Gawal, and I published a piece in Nature Medicine calling for a revolution in oncology where we ensure that cancer treatments really benefit patients. And the fact that we had to call for a revolution, I think, is in itself reason to be alarmed. And we said we need to overhaul the way that we deliver care, the way that we train the next generation of physicians, and how we conduct research and undertake policy work to ensure that we can do better for our patients. And so this began as a conversation and really was actually an offhand comment made at an informal social gathering one night that we should really start a group in Common Sense Oncology. And sure enough, we actually did it. So I spoke to, when we had this idea, I spoke to a professor at the business school and asked if he would help, moderate this group and help us identify who we are and what we cared about, what the problems were, and how we're going to work on it. And he said, sure, Chris, I'll do that, but only 30 people can be in the room to allow meaningful dialogue. So we then had to scratch our heads and think about the 30 people that we want in that room representing diverse health systems, diverse perspectives, and stakeholders. And so last April, gathering at Queen's University here in Kingston, we had 30 people from 15 countries. It was a group of oncologists, academics, journal editors, patients, and patient advocates. And we spent 3 very intense days with lively debate, figuring out what were the major problems in our field, what were we going to work on, where do we believe we have agency. We wanted to be solution focused and not just critics. And so where could we impact things, and what was going to be our work plan? And so this meeting happened in April and culminated with kind of the public launch of Common Sense Oncology in July, with publication of what's been referred to as the Common Sense Oncology Manifesto in July of 2023 in the Lancet Oncology. And this paper really articulates our vision and our mission. Our mission is that cancer care focuses on the outcomes that really matter to patients. The vision is that patients, regardless of where they live, have access to those treatments that really make a big difference in their lives. We have a series of core guiding principles. Access to quality cancer care is a basic human right. Cancer research and delivery of care should be driven by patient and societal needs, not corporate profits. Patient and public involvement is essential when making policy decisions. We think it's reasonable that when patients walk into a cancer hospital, that treatments recommended to them will meaningfully improve how long they live and their quality of life. Of course, all of this is based on truly informed and shared decision-making between patient and oncologist. We believe that cancer treatment should be fairly priced for the benefits they offer and the context in which they are used. We also believe that equity and access to high-quality care should be prioritized by systems just as much as new innovation and new treatments. And finally, recognizing that comprehensive, truly patient-centered cancer care involves much more than just drugs, and we need to ensure that patients have access to the other really important components of care, including psychosocial supports, mental health, survivorship, palliative care, and prevention. We organized our work stream around 3 core pillars: evidence generation, evidence interpretation, and evidence communication. And I'll unpack those a bit. And I should mention that these all now have project teams, very active teams with a mix of academics, oncologists, policymakers, patients, and patient advocates tackling these big topics. Evidence generation is the idea that upstream of every clinical and policy decision are the clinical trials upon which we make decisions. And so this work stream is trying to ensure that clinical trials are better designed and better reported. Evidence interpretation is an educational work stream where we're trying to do a better job educating the next generation of physicians and oncology clinicians to have better skills in epidemiology and critical appraisal so they can dissect strong evidence from weak evidence, treatments which really help patients from treatments which maybe have smaller benefits. And we want to foster a spirit of critical thinking and open inquiry. And the third pillar is around evidence communication. This really is probably the biggest piece of work, which is that we need to do a better job as oncologists talking about these issues and really empowering patients by providing them with meaningful information so they can make informed decisions about their care, but we also can do a better job communicating with media, the public, and policymakers. And so these are a series of project teams that are all co-led by, well, at least a pair of co-leaders, including patient advocates, oncologists, academics, and other stakeholders from around the world. We're tackling clinical trials, education, engagement with stakeholders, what are the patient priorities, and of course, the policies and the politics that govern a lot of these issues. And so just in closing, I'm going to paraphrase just the last couple paragraphs from our essay on Lancet Oncology, just to give you a sense of the ethos of this group. And I should mention this is now a broad-based collective grassroots movement around the world with hundreds if not thousands of members from all different countries and health systems. And we certainly welcome engagement and involvement from everyone here in the audience today. So I'll paraphrase. Common Sense Oncology will promote interventions that measurably improve the lives of patients. We will celebrate well-conducted trials and promote effective treatments, but we will also speak up about and challenge interventions that might cause more harm than good. We will seek to decrease global and regional inequities in access to affordable, high-quality care. Improvements in the generation, interpretation, and communication of evidence will help close these gaps and move our field closer to a future in which a patient's outcome is not determined by where they live, what they can afford, or the strength of a marketing campaign. And with that, I'll close and thank Dr. Mittman and the CADTH team for the opportunity to be here today, and I look forward to questions and comments from the audience. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Booth, for giving us a great overview of the Common Sense Oncology movement and mission, and the evidence supporting your work to date. We do have some time for questions, as Dr. Booth mentioned. If you have questions, please use the question and answer tab at the bottom of the Zoom control bar. I've been monitoring as the presentation has continued, and I have some buckets of themes that we will be able to ask Dr. Booth. We have a little bit of time for sure to ask them. We'll take as many as we can. But maybe I'll take the moderator's prerogative and ask the first question. So Dr. Booth, health regulators and health technology assessment bodies need to balance speed of approval with certainty of benefit. Can you comment on this challenging balance for us? And there are a number of questions within about speed of approval and then unknown beyond that approval as well.
Thanks. It's a really good question. These issues that I presented today are very complicated and nuanced. And so I recognize that there's no clear-cut answers to a lot of these challenges. Balancing speed and certainty is really tricky, and this is where it's hard for our regulators and our HTA bodies. And so obviously we want to get effective treatments available as soon as we can for our patients, but we also want to know that these patients actually help and don't harm. And so we need to find the sweet spot between getting these treatments available, but also knowing, because we could equally be causing harm with these things. And so we need to think about it. And so one model is that if there is reasonable rationale to use progression-free survival or one of these surrogates as the primary endpoint to get an answer perhaps a bit quicker for our patients, that is used for preliminary approval and funding, so it's available for patients while we await the longer-term follow-up to see what the impact was on overall survival and quality of life, and then that can be revisited. So there are some hybrid approaches, but I think it's also worth noting that there's been empiric analysis asking, well, how much faster is it if we, how much quicker do we get answers if we use these surrogates? It's not as much as people think. It's often only measured in months. And so, but I don't want to take away the importance of getting these treatments available quickly to patients, but we need to also make sure we're getting treatments that help and don't harm available.
Thanks for that answer. And maybe I'll ask a question, one more question, and we'll go to the Q&A. You talked about communication and effective communication. So what do you think is needed to improve patient and public understanding of advances in cancer therapies?
Yeah, I think part of the reason to really launch the Common Sense Oncology initiative was to have these conversations. And so these are often uncomfortable things to talk about. They're difficult. But we worried that oncology was becoming a little bit too complacent, and we wanted to be willing to be, self-critical and have some humility and recognize that we've had a lot of advances, but we can do better. And so by creating this forum and this organization, we hope to normalize these conversations and make them more mainstream conversation for all of society and stakeholders to have, rather than, just kind of hallway conversations that people scratching their heads wondering what to do. And we also think that by engaging with the public, we've had a huge amount of interest from the lay press and the media. And I think there's a lot of work to be done then. And again, because of kind of the hope and money kind of dyad that we talked about, often, and this comes from our own field too, the results of clinical trials or new treatments are often overhyped in the media, and this kind of fuels maybe a lack of understanding and maybe unrealistic expectations on the part of all of us. And so I think having the conversations and having more honest discussions about what's really working and maybe some of the challenges in our field is at least the first step.
Yeah, and you've described that well in your guiding principles at the end in the last slide for sure. Let's start, I'll pick away at some of the questions that we have in the Q&A section. One question is, you mentioned more recent drugs showing less value than in the past, but only mentioned the length and quality of life. What about other areas of value, such as reducing caregiver burden, reducing health system costs, reducing environmental impact, etc.? Are there drugs that show less survival but benefits, but are other benefits and still considered low value?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks for that. Again, most of those comments I made were really focused on the typical trial, which is testing new drug versus old drug to see if it's better. But the question is very appropriate because, in fact, in my field, in GI cancer, some of the best advances we've had in the last few years have actually de-escalated treatment intensity for our patients. It's allowed them to have less treatment, fewer side effects, but preserve very good long-term survival. And so you're right. We need those trials. The problem is a lot of those patient-centered trials, which are looking to reduce treatment intensity but preserve outcomes, decrease toxicity, those really aren't in the purview of the pharmaceutical sector, who funds most of our clinical trials. So I think there's a conversation to be had that for us to address these important topics that matter to patients, we need other agencies to step up and fund the clinical trials. And I think that comes to our government funding agencies, our philanthropic groups, and ultimately, I think there's a role for the health system to fund some of these clinical trials that ultimately will probably make things better for patients and save money for the health system, allowing us to reinvest in care, even for those very same patients, to support them in their cancer journey.
Yeah, and I think that that's sort of, as we think about health technology assessment and the evolution from the traditional health technology assessment, are those other variables that we could consider as being part of the value discussion. And I think that's something that's globally a discussion with how health technology is discussed. Another question is, could you please comment on the prevention paradox and how that fits into cancer care? The prevention paradox being that if we had proper cancer screening and prevention, that there may be nothing to observe or less to treat. We can also treat sooner and decrease spending down the line.
Yes, thanks for that. And it goes without saying that the best treatment for cancer is to prevent in the first place. And so I think, again, we've become so focused on treatment that, again, we don't put enough resources into education about things like exercise, diet, mental health. All of these things are known to have a role in the development of cancer, and of course, all this helpful screening and vaccination policies. So this is part of a broader conversation that I think really pertains, I've given this lecture now a number of times, and when I speak to a general audience of physicians from other specialties, they often come up to me after and say, we need common sense cardiology and common sense orthopedic surgery. I think we've had so much advance in innovation, knowledge, and understanding over the last 20 years that the medical system has kind of been in overdrive. And I think maybe we need to stop and take a step back and recognize we need to get back to the basics of helping people live longer and better lives.
Yeah, and maybe just even a quick commentary, for those of the folks who are in the health technology assessment space or the health economic space, the International Society for Pharmacoeconomics and Outcomes Research, or ISPOR, publishes their top 10 list every year. And actually public health was number 10 on the list. The first one was real world evidence, then it was in various orders, I can't remember the ranking, but certainly around pricing and precision medicine and all of those kinds of ideas. But what was interesting is that's fallen much lower. It was much higher during the pandemic in terms of public health. So it's still an important issue for the health economic and for the health services research community to consider. Another question is, how does the rate of growth in healthcare spending compare to the increasing aging population?
Yeah, it's a great question. So some of that trajectory is going to map onto increases in incidence, but there's another figure that I didn't show that's in our paper under review right now, where we track it with the increasing number of cancer cases over time, and it's vastly outstripping it. So some of the spending cost is an aging demographic, but it's largely being driven by, we're lucky in Canada that we have a process of health technology assessment, and a very strong one at that. But a lot of the cancer economics start in the United States, where they don't have that. And essentially, the price that is set is the upper limit that the market will bear, rather than any bearing on kind of what benefit the treatment offers to patients. So that's a really tricky paradigm.
Maybe I'll ask you a question that's more methodological, right? So can you share some examples where the endpoint of progression-free survival would be appropriate and would provide value?
Great question. So surrogate endpoints in general, if it's going to take many, many years to get the answer about overall survival, that's a circumstance where you'd like to get an answer quicker. And so in the adjuvant or curative setting, we might use something like disease-free survival or relapse-free survival. But again, because all these treatments have side effects, and occasionally we've seen that these treatments actually cause net harm, we do want to know, and there's statistical ways of doing this, of establishing true correlation or surrogacy, where we know that if we see improvements in these early disease or relapse-free survival metrics at 2 or 3 years, it on long term will track and translate into improved overall survival. Likewise, for progression-free survival, there are some circumstances in advanced colorectal cancer, for example, where it's been shown to be a very good surrogate and predicts long-term overall survival. So in those circumstances, it makes a lot of sense to use the surrogates, but those are exceptions and not the rule.
So we had a lot of questions on progression-free survival. I'm watching the time. Maybe I'll ask a slightly different question now. Should time spent seeking treatment be part of core outcomes for oncology trials? And if yes, do you suggest measuring it? How do you suggest measuring it? Accounting for the fact that it's very context dependent, for example, community versus academic.
Great, thanks for that question. So I hope you're the reviewer for one of our grants, because we're trying to do a lot of work in this space. So the idea of time toxicity, we've kind of moved into a space where we use the term contact day. And a contact day is any day a patient has contact with the health system, and we're specifically interested in contact with the health system to seek treatment. And yes, we believe this actually should be a measure that's incorporated into every clinical trial. And we've had proposals with some of our major cooperative trials groups partners, including the one based here in Canada, here at Queen's, the Canadian Cancer Trials Group, who has a lot of interest in this very patient-centered endpoint, where we measure not only how long do people live and what the side effects are and their quality of life, but what their life will look like. And if they choose to accept treatment, how much additional time will they spend either in hospital or the emergency room or in the chemotherapy? And again, recognizing that we don't have the answer for any individual patient, but we need to generate the data and share it with patients in a clear and compassionate way so they can make informed decisions about their treatment preferences.
Thanks very much. And maybe just one quick last one, and I keep in mind that there are 55 individuals who have asked really important questions, and we're just chipping away at them. But maybe are pharmaceutical companies involved with the Common Sense Oncology initiative?
So they have not been formally involved thus far. I mean, we just started 6 months ago, and so suffice it to say this has exploded. We've been very, very busy. But what I can tell you is that they're going to be part of the solution. And I can tell you that many individuals who work in the pharmaceutical industry have approached us either privately or in public spaces and said that they actually also agree with this and see value in this space. So I really think that everyone working in the cancer system has the best interest of patients at heart. It's just, I think we just need to take a step back and return to the drawing board. And so I think it's going to take all of us in the system to collectively address some of these solutions to deliver treatments and outcomes that really matter.
So thank you for that response. And unfortunately, we're almost out of time, and we'll have to wrap up this question period. But before I go, perhaps I'd like to ask Dr. Booth for one final opportunity to share a final thought. Maybe if you could provide us with what's the most important takeaway message from your lecture today. In other words, if people only remember one thing from your talk, what would you like it to be?
I think it's clear, compassionate communication. And I think a lot of this, whether it's designing trials, interpreting trials, or making decisions at the bedside with patients and families, or articulating these issues to policymakers, I think it's just having honest conversations about what really works, and then being willing to be self-critical and try to do better for patients. I think that's kind of the key message of this group.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So that brings us to the end of today's session. a big thank you to Dr. Booth for his talk today and answering the questions, and there are many more to answer. And one of them I can answer just now. Somebody asked if the slides will be shared. We'll actually have it on the CADTH YouTube channel, have this presentation up in a few days. So that would be one final answer. Thanks to everyone who tuned in for today's lecture. There will be a short evaluations survey that will open in a window after when you exit Zoom. So please take a moment to fill it out. We were able to plan and strategize about the best kinds of talks to have, and this was a great one to kick off the new year. A quick reminder that the 2024 CADTH Symposium will be held on September 4th to 6th. A call for abstracts is currently out and closes on February 2nd. So please make sure that if you're interested in attending and want to submit an abstract, that's the deadline you're looking for. In addition, please keep an eye on the CADTH website for information about other upcoming events. And with that, I'll sign off. Until next time, wish you a good rest of the day. Thank you.